Hey everybody, my guest today is Professor Roger Crisp, and we're going to talk about hedonism. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks very much, Jason.
Okay, so how would you summarize hedonism?
Well, one important distinction is between psychological hedonism, which is a theory about what makes people act. And the idea is that unless something peculiar is happening, you'll act so as to promote net pleasure. And that might include acting in such a way that you minimize your suffering. You're not guaranteed to get pleasure, of course. But more often, hedonism is used to refer to the view that pleasure is good. Another important distinction might be that between hedonism about welfare or well-being, according to which what's good for a person is net pleasure, and other theories, for example, a desire theory, according to which what's good for people is the satisfaction of their desire. But I think one very important point to make is that there are two aspects to a theory of well-being. There's, first of all, a list of which things are good for people, which things are bad for people, and that's interesting and helpful. But from the philosophical point of view, what's more important is why those things are good or bad. So hedonists shouldn't just say pleasure is the only good. They should say pleasure is the only good because it's pleasant. In other words, as far as I'm concerned, if you say pleasure is the only good and it's good because it satisfies people's desires, that's not hedonism.
Now, one of the main reasons why I thought hedonism was appealing was because it seemed to me, upon reflection, that most, if not all, of the things that I thought were good for me shared a common denominator of being pleasurable. And I think the hedonist has an intuitive position to propose there, right? Because you can just kind of ask people like, well, hanging out with friends, right? You like hanging out with friends, you like eating good food, maybe you like watching movies, like, why are these things good for you? And it just seemed to be the case that they were all pleasant. So it sounds like what you're saying is that you're taking it to the next level, right? You're saying it's not enough just to say that pleasure is the sole good. You're saying that it has to give a reason why pleasure is the sole good. And the reason why is that it's pleasant.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, I would say that a kind of tripartite distinction between different theories of well-being or welfare has become pretty popular in philosophy since the publication of Derek Parfit's Reasons and Persons in 1984. So Parfit says essentially there are three theories. There's hedonism, there are desire or preference accounts, and then there are what he calls objective list accounts. And desire or preference accounts, I think they're a kind of outlier. They're kind of new. They came along at the end of the 19th century, and I think in philosophy they're in decline. And it should be in decline, that view, because it doesn't really make much sense in that nothing can be good for you just because it satisfies a desire that you have, because desire is aimed at the good. So if the satisfaction of desire is good for you, it's good because of the good you get, not through its satisfying a desire. So I think the old debate has been between hedonism and the objective list theory. So the objective list theory says, well, okay, pleasure might be good, but other things are good, like, for example, virtue or accomplishment or knowledge or friendship. And these things are good, as you put it, independently of pleasure, right? So that means this is not a hedonistic theory because these things are not good because they are pleasant. But the hedonist is going to say it's a bit of a coincidence that the things that tend to be put on the list are often pleasant for people.
That would be a coincidence, right? If objective list theory was true. I tend to lean towards the objective list position, but I also feel the force of the hedonist. The way that I see it is that hedonism is an objective list theory with one item on the list, right? So
I think that's dead right, I think.
Yeah, it's hard for me to philosophize about intrinsic goods. And I think it's because they just tend to bottom out. Like, I don't really have an explanation for why I think something like achievement is just good for you, intrinsically good for you. And I can't really explain why I think something like pleasure is good for you. I mean, the suggestion that pleasure is good for you because it's pleasant, I'm not sure how much that explains if I already adopt the position that pleasure is intrinsically good. You know what I mean? So, like, let's take the inverse. Let's take the badness of pain. I would say that pain is intrinsically bad. It could also be instrumentally bad, but I would say it's intrinsically bad. And if you asked me why I thought pain was intrinsically bad, I guess I would say because it hurts, because it's painful. Like, I'm not really sure how much work that's doing.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's right. I guess I wouldn't want to disagree with your analysis of the situation. I mean, I liked your phrase "bottoming out" because I think that points us in the right direction. I think what we have to do is consider the candidate good or the candidate bad at stake, consider it very carefully, think about what it's like, what its properties are, and so on, and then ask ourselves whether we think it's really good or really not good, or even bad. And of course, people differ on that. That's where we've got the debate between hedonism and the list theory. Where do we go when there's a disagreement? Well, you can listen to what the other person says. People don't always do that in philosophy. Listen carefully to what your opponent says and see if they can persuade you. And if they can't, that's really as far as one can go.
Yeah. If that's the case, it just seems quite unsatisfactory. Or at least I don't feel satisfied if we can't really get, if there's this impasse and it's just like, well, I've heard your case, you've heard my case, and we're just going to have to disagree, right? That seems unsatisfactory to me. And I find that I encounter these impasses frequently. So, for instance, something like the intrinsic goodness of life, right? The sanctity of human life. That's something that I've been thinking about. And my position is that it's, life is not intrinsically good. I think it's instrumentally good because it allows us to, feel pleasure or attain the other objective goods, right? But for somebody who just thinks being alive is intrinsically valuable, like, I don't know what to say.
Well, I mean, I feel the same sense of dissatisfaction as you, but things aren't so bad because these situations are found across philosophy, and they're what could keep philosophy going. I mean, if everybody agreed, there wouldn't be any point in philosophy. I mean, it's not clear how one could do it even. And also, I think there are approaches one can take to deep disagreement. One of them has to do with trying to find out what the sources of disagreement are. So there, I think we'd have to make progress in epistemology. And I mean, not just philosophical epistemology, but also, as it were, the natural science of epistemology. How is it that we come to adopt certain beliefs, and why is it that some people come to one position and other people come to another? But we can also think about how we approach the disagreements in question. So one thing I find odd about philosophy is the way that the practice of it is so irrationally dogmatic, in that, it seems to me that when one finds that one disagrees with somebody else, what one should be most interested in doing is hearing their arguments and understanding their position. But what most philosophers are interested in is persuading the other person that they are right. So there's a huge amount of table thumping in philosophy, and I think there are probably evolutionary reasons for that we don't properly understand. But if that's true, it doesn't mean that we're determined to do it. We could approach philosophy in a different way.
Yeah, that just reminds me of philosophy conferences where everyone in the audience is trying to poke holes in your argument. I mean, I appreciate that exercise, but at the same time, I wish sometimes it wasn't combative. So I want to get deeper into hedonism, and one of the common objections that I hear about hedonism is that if that is what's ultimately good for a human being, then that is not a worthwhile life, because we can experience pleasure in all different kinds of ways, right? And not all of them are equal in terms of quality, in terms of perhaps matching our dignity or worth as human beings. What's your response to that?
Okay, well, I mean, one direction one could go in is to distinguish between higher and lower pleasures, as John Stuart Mill did in his famous discussion of pleasure and utilitarianism in chapter 2 of his book, Utilitarianism. And he was responding to the accusation made by people like Carlyle in the 19th century that utilitarianism was the philosophy of swine for the sorts of reasons that you're giving there, that, low-grade sort of physical pleasure is as good as the pleasure you get from listening to a late Beethoven quartet or sonata or something. And it's not absolutely clear what Mill was claiming, but it could be that he was saying that these higher pleasures are such that you wouldn't give them up for any amount of lower pleasure. So they've got a kind of superiority to them, which puts the Beethoven pleasure above the lower animal pleasures. But there's then going to be a question about how one lives one's own life. I mean, it could then have that view could then have the implication that you should live an extremely ascetic intellectual life, as I suppose to some extent Mill himself did, but not entirely. And it also seems, as it were, too extreme, because it's just comparing two episodes of pleasure with one another, whereas I think many people would say what we ought to be doing is considering a life, and a life in which there is a preponderance perhaps of higher pleasures may be more valuable than a life which is dominated by lower pleasures. So I think that's one sort of response. Another response is justify the bullet and say that this is a rather precious view, and in fact, the reason people like listening to Beethoven is the same reason that people like drinking Coke. It's just there's stuff going on in their brain which feels good, and that's all there is to it. And that leads to a kind of liberalism, I suppose, about pleasures, a kind of free for all. You can pursue whatever you like.
When I have this discussion with my students, I'll bring up a hypothetical scenario, right? Like I give a short lecture about hedonism, and then I ask them, okay, let's say that you're a parent, okay? And you have a teenage daughter or son, and you find drugs in their room, right? And so you confront them, and then your kid says, well, pleasure is the only thing that's good for us, right? And I'm doing drugs, and doing drugs gives me a pleasure, so what's the big deal? And the response that I'm trying to get from my students is like, well, the hedonist doesn't have to say that that's overall good for their kid, right? Because doing drugs can lead to addiction. It can cause more pain than pleasure. So there's a way that the hedonist can respond. But let's say that we could create a drug that did not have addictive properties, that did not have withdrawal symptoms, right? That it really just gave you this sensation of pleasure. It seems like the hedonist will have to say, well, that is actually good for you.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it could be worse than that. I mean, it could be that the hedonist would have to say, if the drug is good enough and it's really producing a lot of pleasure, then you should take the drug rather than do anything else. But I do think they're bound to that. I mean, I think that, as it were, judgments about what's pleasurable are to a large extent subjective. So I think it's open to somebody to say, look, when I consider what a life like that is going to be like, the life on the drug, and I compare it to what we would count as a pretty valuable human life in contemporary circumstances involving a huge range of pleasures, higher and lower, if we want to use that terminology, I just think that the more varied life is more pleasurable. In other words, pleasure isn't something that comes in units that have to be sort of totted up, so that some huge amount of drug experience must be more valuable than the life with the varied pleasures. It's kind of up to us to decide how pleasurable something is. Well, when I say it's up to us to decide, I mean it's up to us to judge.
Interesting. Okay, I want to dive a little deeper into that. It seems that if the hedonist claims that pleasure is the sole good, that they would also have to claim that more pleasure is better than less.
Yeah.
Other theorists of well-being probably have that assumption as well, right? Like if you think knowledge is good, then more knowledge is better than less knowledge, right?
Yeah.
Sounds reasonable. Okay, so if more of this good thing is better for you, then how could it not be reduced to units? Like I've heard the term hedons used, right? It's a unit of pleasure. Like what if two hedons are better than one, then how would you not use this type of additive approach?
That, I think, is what Mill was trying to argue against, that judgments about pleasure needn't rest on the assumption that there's some kind of hedon, which is found to a certain degree in Beethoven and to a certain degree in animal pleasures, so that if you have enough animal pleasures, they're going to add up to more pleasure than the pleasure in the Beethoven. That just doesn't seem to follow to me.
The way that I understood the higher and lower pleasure distinction was that the higher quality pleasures were the pleasures that you experienced when you exercised and or developed your higher human capacities, or the capacities that kind of distinguish us from the rest of the animal kingdom. So the pleasures that we could share with the animals, like eating, that would be a base pleasure, right? But something like listening to music and appreciating music, that would be a higher pleasure because, cats and dogs cannot do that. Is that your understanding as well?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think what's coming in is what some people call a discontinuity of value. So if you imagine a very bizarre situation where you're waiting to be born, as it were, so you have to imagine you're a soul, you haven't yet lived, and you're told, there's a choice between two different lives. The first life will be relatively short. You'll be born, as it were, with a fully developed intellect and sense of humour and so on, and you'll have enough time in a relaxed atmosphere to read all the novels of Jane Austen and enjoy them and their insights into the human condition and so on. Or you can drink lemonade. Okay, that's the choice. So nothing else goes on in either of these lives than those things. It seems to me it's not incoherent to say, well, I would prefer the Austen life, however long you make the lemonade life. And I would do that because I would enjoy it more. I'd get more enjoyment out of that life. It doesn't matter how long the lemonade life goes on for. I wouldn't enjoy it as much.
Yeah, I do find that response intuitive, but I also see some potential problems with it. So when I think of a base pleasure, I think of maybe like eating fast food or something like that. I love fast food. Okay. It's really bad for me, but I love it. And no amount of fast food can equate to the pleasure that I get from doing philosophy. So I understand that there is some sort of higher and lower pleasure distinction. It makes sense to me. And as an experienced judge, I would pick doing philosophy. It's just hard for me it's hard for me to see how that would be true in every single circumstance. For me, philosophy and fast food, that's obvious. But you could imagine situations where perhaps enough of a lower pleasure would be better hedonistically than one higher pleasure. You know what I mean?
Well, then I think we're not using the higher-lower distinction in quite the same way, because I was using it, as it were, to bring in a discontinuity. And if there isn't a discontinuity there, we're just dealing with pleasures which are very different from one another, of a type, which maybe a small amount of one is more enjoyable than a small amount of another, but a huge amount of the other actually is more enjoyable than the small amount of the first. And I think another way to make these discontinuities seem plausible is to think about bad things as well. So we've been talking about what you might call a good discontinuity. But think about a bad one. So this is one where, again, you're waiting to experience a life, but this time you're in hell, okay? And the devil is in charge. And the devil says, look, I've got a choice of lives here. There's one in which you experience the most horrible torture, electric shock torture, waterboarding, all these sorts of dreadful things. And, that'll go on for, let's say, 50 years. Or you can have a life of hangnail pleasure. And let's say that'll go on for 100 years. You might say, well, I'll take the hangnail, right? It's a bit longer. It's twice as long, but it definitely sounds preferable to the 50 years of torture. So the devil says, actually, this is really annoying me because I wanted you to choose the life of torture. So I'm going to extend the hangnail life where you've got this minor irritation. In fact, I'm going to make it infinitely long. So you're going to live forever suffering this minor twinge. It seems to be quite coherent to say, well, I'll take the minor twinge. That's any amount of that is better than 50 years of the most horrible torture.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that's a good thought experiment. I would agree with your intuition. An infinite number of years with a minor discomfort is better than 50 years of horrendous torture. So if that is indicative of anything, you think that it is also true in terms of pleasure. Like if it's true of pain, then it would have to be true of pleasure as well.
I suppose it would be a bit peculiar if it weren't, but it's possible. I mean, pain is very different from pleasure. I think, as it were, there's a good case to be made for both good and bad discontinuities.
So it's hard for me to kind of tease out the different aspects of pain and pleasure, right? So one is duration. And then we've been talking about quality as well, but the other is something like intensity, right? So when I think about pain and being tortured, that seems to be like a high intensity experience, right? Versus a minor discomfort. So I guess the parallel when it comes to pleasure then would have to be like a small pleasure that goes on infinitely versus a very high intensity pleasure for 50 years. I feel like that would be comparable.
I think that's right. But I think it's also important to remember that the pains experienced in torture are not, as it were, what you might call synchronic pains. They're not all pains that happen, as it were, in a moment. Some of them will be, obviously, the sheer physical pain as the electric shock passes through you are synchronic, but others are diachronic. So the emotions that people feel when they're being tortured, as it were, take time. They're not complete at one time, as Aristotle might put it. So if you think about dread, panic, despair, said to degradation and so on, fear, these it's hard to understand these. I mean, they obviously they are a series of moments, but it's hard to grasp them as a series of moments. Their content seems to be best understood diachronically, whereas with the hangnail, that doesn't. I mean, that's just moments of minor pain.
That leads me to my next question, which is whether or not there's a higher and lower quality distinction when it comes to pain. So I think, if we want to maintain the distinction in the sense that, higher quality pleasures are the ones that, rational beings can experience, then higher quality pains would also be the pains that only rational beings can experience. So what are the type of pain that we can experience but cats and dogs cannot, or other animals cannot?
Yeah. Well, I think there is, and actually I think the example with the devil illustrates that. So, as it were, the life of torture is a higher pain. And I think there's also a case to be made for discontinuities between bad and good. So there's quite a nice discussion of how to value good and bad things in a book by the great American philosopher C.I. Lewis, which I think came out in the 40s, called An Analysis of Knowledge and Valuation. And he says, look, you're trying to compare the value of two states of affairs. Let's say they both involve sentient beings. Imagine yourself living through the experiences or the lives of all the individuals involved in these circumstances. And I think if you adopt C.I. Lewis's model, the conclusions seem rather pessimistic because it looks as if there may be painful experiences which are so bad that they can't be counterbalanced by any amount of good. So, there are people who've been tortured absolutely horribly for very long periods. If you imagine being told in one of these peculiar thought experiments, well, you can either have nothing at all, or you can have a mixture of experiences. You could have these really, really horrible ones, but they'll be counterbalanced perhaps by millions of really good experiences of people enjoying, you're enjoying time with your family and watching great films and so on. I must say, when I think about those sorts of decisions, it doesn't seem to me at all implausible to say I'd rather have nothing, which is a pessimistic view about the future of the world. It implies that it would actually be better if the world just stopped.
Yeah, that makes me think of David Benatar and his anti-natalist position. Right? He does argue for this empirical asymmetry between like the goods and bads and the pains and pleasures that people can experience. And he does say like the pains weigh more heavily than the pleasures. So imagine yourself enduring, the worst amount of torture, and asking yourself if you would go through that in order to experience the highest goods in life and the highest pleasures in life. And he thinks that people would not. And when I ask myself that hypothetical, I would agree. I don't think I would be willing to go through like the worst tortures to experience the highest pleasures. There is some part of me that is convinced that the worst pains in the world prudentially outweigh the highest pleasures in the world.
Yeah. But yeah, I agree. But that doesn't mean we have to adopt the Benatar position, because I think you and I would probably accept there have been many lives, I hope including yours, in which the balance of pleasure is over pain is positive. The point is, if you're thinking about a world in the C.I. Lewis way, you have to imagine living through the bad lives as well as the good lives. And then, as it were, the pain seemed to have a higher salience and significance.
Yeah, I would agree. I think empirically, at least my life at least, and I hope, most people's lives, overall, I would say has been more good than bad.
But I mean, one problem with this view, I mean, it may be problematic anyway, because people just find it implausible. A lot of people find it implausible. But if you attach it to standard decision theory, the implications are very strange, because a tiny chance of you ending up being tortured in that way, and there is always that tiny chance, of course, suggests that it would be rational to commit suicide as soon as possible. But that could be a problem with standard decision theory rather than the discontinuity claim.
So let's say that we can create some sort of drug that just makes you feel this high amount of pleasure, okay, without the withdrawal symptoms, without the addictive properties. It seems that the hedonist then, if the hedonist has to bite the bullet and say, well, actually, yeah, that is good for you, and if the drug is good enough, it would be the best life. Does a hedonist necessarily have to be committed to the claim that we ought to do what's good for us?
No, I don't think so. I mean, is this a situation where there's a choice between doing what's good for me and doing something else which is beneficial for other people? Is that the kind of case you had in mind?
Yeah, so one would be, I'm just not going to take this drug all the time because I have responsibilities and I ought to, take care of my children or something like that. But I was also thinking of perhaps there are other values at stake here. Perhaps we don't just care about well-being because it's just one dimension of human life. Perhaps there's this other dimension of meaning or fulfillment that we also should care about as well. And so even if it were the case that taking this drug every day would give us the highest pleasure that a human being can experience, it actually detracts from the other dimensions of human life.
Yeah, that's a very interesting idea. And as you know, I mean, there's a huge amount of evidence that meaning does matter to people. People care about their lives having a meaning, and they really don't like it if they conclude that their lives are meaningless. But then there are some serious questions to ask them about what they mean by meaning. If they say, well, I think, I've been thinking about the universe and it's so large and I'm just a little speck, my life seems meaningless. One might then ask, well, why does that matter to you? Unless you think it's somehow making your own life less good for you. If it's not doing that, and you're saying you're just making an evaluative claim about what's good in the universe, and you don't seem to matter very much in the universe, that's not really significant from your own perspective. It doesn't affect the value of your own life. And I also suspect that when people make these claims about meaninglessness, they are also talking about well-being. So one of the goods that people would want to put on the list these days would be accomplishment, sort of making a difference to the world. And as you said at the start, I mean, that often is something people enjoy, but it could be valuable on its own. So if you say my life's meaningless, you could be saying I'm not accomplishing anything in my life. My life's not making a difference in that sense. But that's a standard, as it were, welfareist value. It's not meaning as something independent of well-being.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to figure out. Like, if there are these other dimensions that contribute to the best human life, or are they all reducible to pleasure and pain, right? So if somebody says, my life is meaningless, maybe there is no purpose to my life, And I was like, well, does that just mean that you're experiencing more pain than pleasure? Like, would you feel the same way if you were engaging in activities that you found pleasurable, right? Because if that were the case, then it's really just another way of describing that you're experiencing more pain than pleasure. Like, hedonists can account for that, right? The trickier cases that I'm thinking about are the people who are towards the end of their life. I work a lot on assisted death stuff. And when you look at the reasons why people choose assisted death, pain is not the top three. It may not even be the top five. They'll say things like, loss of autonomy, maybe loss of dignity, the inability to do things that they want. Maybe they're just tired of life. They'll say something like that. Or maybe they feel like their life has been completed. So I can imagine a hedonist saying, well, yeah, that's just all different ways that you experience pain. It really just comes down to this pleasure-pain balance. All right. What would you say in response to that?
Well, I mean, taking that as a psychological claim seems to me, without evidence, a bit dubious. I mean, we'd need to go further into the particular cases, because it could well be that these people believe that lacking autonomy is in itself bad, and this gives them a reason for bringing it about that their life ends right now. I guess some psychological hedonists might say, oh, well, actually, really what's going on is that you're finding the thought of not being autonomous unpleasant, and that's why you want to end the state that you're in. But again, I mean, that's arguable, and it would probably be something that we could determine using neuroscience. And I suspect we'd find it's not true, that actually people do think that lacking autonomy is bad in itself. And then we get back to the debate between hedonism and different theories of well-being.
Do you find hedonism convincing?
I do, yeah. I find it more convincing than any other view that I've contemplated. But I also recognise that other people who are my epistemic peers think differently. So we get back to the issue of how to respond to disagreement.
What do you think about the experience machine objection? Are you moved by it at all, or do you think that there is a convincing response?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, as you said, it's a very influential objection to hedonism, this Nozick's experience machine. I mean, the experience machine example itself is quite complicated, and you have to imagine whether you're going to plug in and so on. So I think we can just make it simpler by imagining a case. I mean, it would be rather bizarre, but imagine that we can compare the life of, say, the composer Haydn, who obviously accomplished a lot and enjoyed it, was recognised in his own lifetime. I think he had quite a long life. He had friends. He lived what most people would say was a pretty good life. Imagine that somehow we've recorded the phenomenology of his experience, and we can somehow play it back to a newborn baby, so that baby, and we, the baby is on a machine and we feed it and so on. Of course, he doesn't know it's on the machine because we're just playing back the phenomenology of Haydn's life. I think a hedonist has to accept that the life of that baby is as good as the life of Haydn's, but I don't think that's a fatal objection.
The way that the thought experiment is constructed, it gives you a choice, right? And we're comparing these two states. You're plugged into the machine or you're not plugged into the machine. And from the third person's perspective, we're asked to evaluate the potential value of those two lives, right? But of course, when you're in the machine, you don't know that you're in the machine. So epistemically, it's from a different standpoint, right? So if you were to ask me, Jason, you're married, right? You want to be in a happy relationship. You want your kids to love you, right? But do you want just to feel that way? Do you want just to believe that that's true? Or do you actually want it to be true, right? And if you present the question to me like that, I'm obviously going to say that I actually want it to be true, right? But that kind of changes the scenario so much so that I feel like doesn't really get to the heart of hedonism, because from this perspective, you're making me think, oh, it's possible for everybody to just be lying to me. It's possible that my wife doesn't love me. It's possible that my kids don't love me. And with that knowledge, that gives me pain.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I'd say the question really is whether anything can make you better or worse off independently of your experience. And yeah, that's a metaphysical issue as well as an evaluative one. And I remember once Dale Jameson saying to me, we were talking about the experience machine, and he said, imagine that some philosopher like Berkeley was right, and actually, idealism is correct. And when you die, you'll meet God, and God will say, you thought you were in this kind of independent universe, but actually you were just part of my mind. What are you going to say? I think you're going to say, wow, that's pretty interesting. Yeah, I'm kind of glad to know that. But you're not going to think, oh, my life was a complete disaster because I was in the mind of God. And
Interesting.
It could be that that's the right attitude, So the lucky child on the experience machine who gets Haydn's life at the end of it should perhaps say, well, great, that was good.
I'm wondering what you think about how hedonism relates to the other theories of well-being, because, of course, all the major ones are plausible to some extent, right? Smart people wouldn't be adopting these theories if they weren't plausible, at least a little bit. And when I think of nature fulfillment theories, who say that what's good for you is to exercise and develop your characteristic human capacities, it seems strange to me that there's so much overlap, right? So you have this hedonism theory, and it's just kind of off in one corner of this theoretical map, and it says, look, pleasure is the sole good because it's pleasant, okay? And like some other spectrum, the other side of the map, you have someone like a nature fulfillment theory. It's like, no, what's good for you is to fulfill your human nature, okay? But it's like, well, there's so much overlap, though. Why is there so much overlap? Why is it the case that developing my rational capacities tends to be more pleasurable? Why do I find philosophy more pleasurable than eating fast food? Right? Like, it seems weird that if you both came at the same question independently from each other, and but there's still huge overlap. Like, why is there that overlap?
Yeah, that is a very good question. It's not unique to theories of well-being. So if you think about morality, for example, I guess most moral philosophers would think that, torturing an innocent being was bad. So on the substantive questions of which things are morally bad and morally good, there's going to be quite a lot of agreement. And where they'll differ is in why those things are bad. So a utilitarian will say, oh, it's bad because it decreases the overall goodness of the world or something like that. Whereas the deontologist will say, no, it's just wrong to treat another being in that way. And then, of course, you get the same phenomenon with theories of well-being. I guess the hedonist is going to say, well, the reason that we get that in the case of well-being is that actually the non-hedonists are finding accomplishment, friendship, knowledge, and so on pleasant. And then they're somehow misled into thinking that those things are valuable in themselves. But that's not a knockdown argument. I mean, there could be other explanations as to why we do that. I mean, for example, a determinist will say, well, it's not, you don't make a free decision about which things are good and bad for you in your life and which things you pursue and which you don't pursue. These are things that just happen. And given that we're the kinds of beings that we are, we will go for relationships with other people. We'll go for work and accomplishment. We'll go for understanding the world.
Yeah, so they're all working with the same set of data, but they're extrapolating different theories from it. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's right.
But that still doesn't answer, I guess, the fundamental question that I have, which is, why is it more pleasurable to do things that tend to fulfill our nature?
Yeah, I mean, it's true that is the case, but it's a generalization, isn't it? I mean, there will be cases where you can fulfill your nature by doing certain things that don't give you pleasure. So the hedonist has got a knockdown argument here. There's still a genuine debate to be had about whether fulfilling your nature on reflection seems to be valuable in itself. And there's no denying that's appeared to be the case to many major philosophers.
Do you put much weight on this quality distinction between higher and lower pleasures?
I would, as far as discontinuities go. I think discontinuities may exist. but I wouldn't really want to articulate which are the higher pleasures or which are the lower pleasures.
The reason why I ask is because just I'm thinking from the perspective of a parent, right? I obviously want my children to live lives that are good for them. And I would naturally look at the theories of well-being to see what kind of advice that they would give. And if I'm focused on hedonism, then I would tell my kid, yeah, you should experience high-quality pleasures. You should focus your life on those, not so much on the low-quality pleasures. They're not as good for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think other things being equal, that's pretty good advice. And I think, again, that goes back to thinking about the enjoyableness of a life as a whole. If you're considering lives in which there is a pretty large number of higher pleasures as well as the lower ones, that just seems more enjoyable.
So your explanation then for why pleasure is good is the fact that it's pleasant. It's just this subjective experience, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that does sound intuitive to me, again, because it's intuitive to me to say like the universe, right? Like that pain is bad for you because it's painful, because, it hurts. Is there anything more to say to somebody who is just not convinced by that, right? If somebody asks you, well, why is pleasantness good for you? Like, why is that feeling ultimately good, right? Maybe they're coming from more of a nature fulfillment tradition. What would you say in response?
I think one reaches bedrock at a certain point where there's no more to say, and there are people who just be fully committed to the fulfillment of the nature or perfectionist position. There may be cases in which one can criticize the theory itself. So I think that would be harder in the case of perfectionism, because it does seem, on the face of it, intuitively plausible. But if we're talking to somebody who says, well, pleasure is not in itself good, it's good just because it fulfills a desire that you have for it. And many people have thought that. They thought we do desire pleasure. It's natural to us to do that. And so it's good for us because we desire it. But that does seem to me to get things the wrong way round. I mean, if we're rational, we're going to desire pleasure because it's good. If we find out, if we start taking the view that pleasure is actually not good or bad, there's no reason to desire it, and we should try to wean ourselves off it.
So in terms of pleasure and this subjective feeling, is it possible for someone to be born with a condition in which they do not feel pleasure?
Well, I mean, there is a psychological condition which is called anhedonia, which is obviously a kind of a condition related to depression, where people are unable to experience pleasure.
So then this would just be some particular property of that person's brain, right? So they do all the things that everybody else does and yet derive no pleasure from those activities. So the hedonist would have to say, well, I mean, just that really means that nothing is good for you.
Yeah, that's right.
So then how is a person to decide how to live their life? You know what I mean? I guess you're just trying to minimize pain at that point, assuming that they can feel pain.
Well, I guess one response to that would be, even if they are themselves hedonists, to reflect upon the fact that many people haven't been hedonists and aren't hedonists now, and they could be right. Many of them will be epistemic peers. So unless the life is one of net pain, the rational thing would be to go on living it, as long as you're gaining enough accomplishment, friendship, and other goods.
Okay. So what I'm trying to get at is, if there are other dimensions that you think people ought to use to guide how they live their lives. Because reducing it to pleasure and pain, that's simple enough, and I think it's intuitive because most people have experienced those two things, right? But are there other elements that people should consider? So, one thing is maybe a higher lower pleasure distinction, right? Exercise your higher capacities. That's one more specific piece of advice that you could give people in terms of how they can increase their well-being, right? But what about like doing things that have a larger impact, right? Or helping others or something like that. I feel like there is much more to say about living the best human life other than just saying maximize your pleasure.
I think that's right. I think there's an analogy here between hedonism as a theory of well-being and utilitarianism as a moral theory, in that if you look at utilitarianism since it arose in, the 17th century or 18th century, very few utilitarians have said to people, utilitarianism is correct, therefore go around trying to live your life in accordance with it. They've said utilitarianism is correct. Don't try to put it into practice on the whole. Follow the common sense morality that you've been taught, but perhaps be a bit more reflective about some elements of it. For example, in the case of Mill, if common sense morality is sexist in various ways, try to change it and try to change your own views. In more modern times, somebody like Peter Singer has said over much of his life, utilitarianism is true. Don't try to live your life fully in accordance with it, but think about the common sense view of generosity. It seems, given the situation in the world at the moment, it's unsatisfactory. You really ought to be giving quite a lot more of your income and what you own to effective charities. And I think it's the same with hedonism. The hedonist will say, don't go around trying to pursue pleasure, because that will lead you into what some people have called the paradox of hedonism. If you try to promote pleasure, you'll get less. So the classic case is the person playing tennis, the hedonist playing tennis, who's running around playing tennis but constantly thinking, am I getting the maximum pleasure out of this game? And of course they're not, because they ought to be enjoying the game and trying to play the game as well as possible. But I think most hedonists would say, think carefully about the aims that you do have in life and ask yourself whether you really do enjoy the objects you're pursuing. And if not, would it be more reasonable for you to switch to something else?
That just brings up other questions. I find it interesting that maybe a philosopher will come up with a theory of something like morality or well-being, but the advice being, don't let it dictate your life. Live the life in a more commonsensical way, but be more reflective. That seems a little, I don't know, that seems a little weird to me. I mean, I can understand the paradox of hedonism objection. I think if you're actively just thinking about how do you maximize pleasure, that's probably not the best way to go about it. But it just seems to me that there are other things that people, that at least from a parent's perspective, that there are other bits of advice that you're going to give your kid than ways of maximizing their pleasure. So this kind of leads to the other issue that I wanted to bring up, and you kind of touched upon it in your last answer, which is the distinction between well-being and morality. So I am one of those people who believe that they are separate. Do you think that they're separate as well?
Yes, I do. So I think well-being is to do with what's good or bad for individuals, whereas morality is to do with what's right or wrong. I think more foundationally, it's to do with what reasons we have to act or not to act in various ways.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense to me. So then, if we adopt this distinction between well-being and well-being and morality, and we're parents and we want our kids to live the best lives, do you think that the best human life is one in which there's maximal well-being and the person is, I guess, like a really good person?
Yeah, that sounds like it would be hard to beat.
The reason why I ask it is because I'm interested in anything that contributes to the best human life. And I don't know if it's reducible to well-being, and I don't know if it's reducible to morality. I think a conjunction of the two sounds very plausible to me. But what about something like beauty, aesthetic value, right? Like I would say, all things equal, a life with beauty in it is better than one without, but I don't know if it's necessarily a prudential value. Right? Like maybe there's this other dimension of the human condition that contributes to like the best version of it. And perhaps one of that is aesthetic value. What do you think?
Well, I mean, that's certainly an option. I mean, there's no reason why a hedonist about well-being has to believe that the only value there is in contemplating some great work of art is the pleasure that comes from that, as if the painting itself is not worth anything. I mean, you can be a non-hedonist about aesthetic value, and then suggest that people can enjoy contemplating that value. I think there are arguments for what you might call global hedonism. So this would be the view that the only value anywhere is pleasure, and the only disvalue is pain. And then you're going to have to give some story about what's going on with great works of art and beautiful landscapes and so on. And I suspect they would probably be slightly debunking stories, that we find certain things attractive for evolutionary reasons. This is really a kind of dumbed down version of this view, but in the distant past, it could be that one mate would be attracted to another mate because they could create complexity in various ways. So complexity emerges as a value, and then we end up admiring Raphael.
It's a deep discussion. It raises so many more questions than it answers. I think it's a good place to wrap things up. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Jason. It's been a pleasure.